So we saw earlier on how Paul was prepared to use his freedom to adapt the way that he shared the gospel. The message of the gospel never changed. The need for people to repent never changed. The need to live a radically different life never changed. But the way in which Paul communicated the message changed as he moved from one group of people to another. Now, obviously, there aren't quite as many of us here this afternoon as there are some weeks. But even when we look around, just this small number of people here that are here today, it's obvious that we don't all look exactly the same. And when you start talking to people who even do maybe look the same, you quickly discover that they sound different to one another. And so, we don't have very many here this morning, but I was wondering what different nationalities we have represented here. And those of you that are watching online, if you haven't already answered my question, now would be a good time to do that. There's only a 20-second lag, so you have to type very fast. But what nationalities or backgrounds or ethnic roots do we have represented here today? British? Scottish? Danish? Nigerian? I was going through the address list of the church, and we have got South Africans, we have got people from Wales, Zimbabwe, Russian, we've got German, and we've got a number of families from Hong Kong. And so even within kind of a rural village context, we have a number of different cultures represented, and therefore we need to be aware of cultural differences. And so there are differences that exist between us based on where we come from, based on our culture, based on our background. But there are other barriers, other cultural barriers that also exist, which get in the way when we seek to share the gospel. Now, how many of you, when you think about the 1980s, how many of you kind of think of it just in terms of it wasn't that long ago? It was just like maybe 10 years ago, just 20 years ago. Well, two things I saw on social media this week. The first was a meme, and I can't remember the exact words, but it was something along the lines of, we are now as far away from the 80s as the 80s were from the 1940s. So if you were growing up in the 80s, the way that you view the 40s, like ancient history, is the way that young people growing up today view the 80s when maybe you were growing up. And so when we think about communicating the gospel with young people or with young adults, what worked in the 1980s doesn't necessarily work now, just like what worked in the 40s didn't work in the 80s. Mobile phones and social media are such an integral part of life for so many young people and young adults. There's a typical picture. And so that needs to be a part of the equation too. Just like you wouldn't dream of going to Chad to share the gospel without learning some French and some Arabic. So if we're going to be able to communicate with young people and with young adults, we need to be conscious of learning their language. And a part of that will be digital. I'm not asking us to become fluent. I was talking to Sophie about this yesterday, and she couldn't believe that there are some people in the church that don't have Facebook. Shock horror. People, how could you survive without Facebook or Instagram?
Very well, thank you.
So I'm not asking us all to become fluent in digital. I'm just asking us to at least engage with it and to not assume that that's automatically a bad thing. Some of us, we just imagine that social media is all bad. But maybe it's not. Maybe there are some good things, and maybe the church can get on board and use some of these ways to communicate the gospel, to break down barriers that exist. One of the things that I found really helpful when I've been in other countries is you're not the expert. You don't know anything. And so that means that you need to ask lots of questions. You need to, well, how do I say this? What does that mean? What on earth is this vegetable, and how am I supposed to cook it? And so you're never short of conversation starters because you're not the expert. You're asking questions and inviting answers. And so that's one of the things that we need to remember when we go into different cultures and when we're looking around even today. We've got different cultures. Be interested. Ask questions. Learn from those that know what they're talking about. The other thing that I saw on Twitter this week was this link to an article in the Church Times from August 2017. So it's not up to date. But it was talking about the class divide in the church and how that the UK church is dominated by the middle class and therefore it's failing to reach the working class. Just a few extracts from what I thought was a really interesting article. And they were conscious that they were making generalizations, and they did highlight that, but from those that have been working amongst different communities, they said the working class are straight talking, but the middle class see them as rude. Whereas the middle class are polite, but the working class see them as two-faced or dishonest. Another comment, among the barriers to change that are explored in the book are materialism, individualism, and cynicism. And the more time I spend with people facing poverty, the more aware I am of my need to change more than theirs. For those of you that are one step ahead of where I'm going, you may have already realised that therefore, how can you say that digital is the answer? Well, I'm not saying that digital is the answer. Digital is not necessarily the way to reach all young people, but we just need to have it on our radar. And so we talked about some of the barriers to the gospel that could exist between people from different ethnic backgrounds, people from different generations, and people from different classes and economic backgrounds. And I really just want to kind of leave it there, just to start to kind of flag up some of these issues, not to give any answers, but just to invite us to start thinking about, in our own context, where I work or where I live or the people that I mix with. What are some of the different cultures, and therefore what are some of the cultural barriers to the gospel that may exist? Maybe that's in the workplace, maybe it's in the school environment, maybe it's amongst our neighbours. And to think about who are the people who need to meet Jesus? And am I unintentionally putting up barriers to them coming to meet Jesus for cultural reasons? And are there barriers that I can knock down and tear down, so to make it easier for people to respond to the gospel? It comes back really to where we were last week, when we were thinking about there's no kind of master blueprint that tells you exactly how each of us is to behave in every situation. We need to keep close to Jesus, and we need to be constantly asking him to show us what does it mean? Who are the people that need to hear about Jesus? Who are the people that need their lives transformed? And how can I best share Jesus with them? We're going to pray, and then in a few minutes' time we're going to sing our final two songs.